Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is J.P. Holding, and he's come on the show to talk about a timely book, very important, 1 week after Easter. Title of his book is Defending the Resurrection. Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? And this is not his only book. He's written 20 books. I'm going to list some of the titles, but he's written Easter is Pagan and Other Fables, also What in Hell is Going On, Scripture and Slavery, also Jesus Was a Mushroom and Other Lies You Won't Believe, The Best Evidence for Jesus, Blood Moon Lunacy, and Christian Answers to This Generation's Questions. And there's a bunch of others. He's addressed the Jesus myth in a series of books. His ministry and website can be found at www.tectonics.org, and I will list that in the show notes so you can see all his writing and his activities. He's done a lot of work in Christian apologetics. And again, we're going to talk about this book, Defending the Resurrection, that he's written a lot of, and there's other guests who've written sections of the book. So he can talk more about that. So J.P. Holding, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on tonight, William. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Well, thanks for agreeing. And so for people who may not have heard your name, your work, you've written, you said you were involved in the internet before it was the internet. Maybe you can talk where it all started and how you came up with 20 books to write.
All right. Well, my degree is in library science. So I'm a librarian by training, and that means more than just I know how to tell people to be quiet. It means I know how to do research, how to find answers to people's questions. And it's something I really enjoy doing. And to fill in the blanks on that, the internet before it was the internet. I was in school back in the early 90s when the internet was still mostly a military application, but when things like bulletin boards were just starting to be the rage. And I learned how to use databases that worked just like Google before Google existed, using various search methods to find answers to people's questions and specialty areas. And so I had somewhat of a head start before many people had access to the internet, learning how to use the tools that were associated with it. And so along with the specialty and love of doing research, that came writing books on answering people's questions and addressing arguments that I saw out there. And it's just gone on from there. I just love to write. I just love to do research. And all those books is the result.
Gotcha. And when was the first book that you wrote? What was the date of it? When did you start writing?
Wow. Probably the earliest of any sort may have been, if I'm thinking back through the dates here, it was probably the Mormon Defenders. Yes, the Mormon Defenders. And Mormon Defenders was written before you could do electronic publishing. So I sort of had to do it the old-fashioned way at the time, which is I had to actually go with a publisher that printed the books on paper. And some young people may not have heard of books on paper, but that was the way it used to be done. And I still have a few copies of that book hanging around here somewhere. And I recently did a video series based on it. Mormonism has changed so much since that date. I actually, I published that one in 2001. So that was the very first book out of all the ones that I put together.
So that's over 20 years ago you started writing, and you've covered a lot of these kind of maybe fads, you could call them, or trends in Christianity, because I've heard people make the arguments that Christianity was influenced by mushroom taking and then the blood moon stuff. So you've addressed kind of those kind of maybe popular topics, maybe, right?
It's fair to say that I've often addressed topics that no one else will touch because they just don't want to jump into it. It just seems like so much trouble to jump into it. And you alluded to the mushroom thesis, and that particular book was about conspiracy theories. Many people don't want to talk about conspiracy theories or look into them or do the hard research necessary, and I can understand why, because just to use an example from a similar topic, that of the idea that Jesus was stolen from pagan gods. The story of Jesus was an imitation of other pagan deities, like, for example, Mithra. Now, some of these critics will say, for example, that like Jesus, Mithra was crucified and rose from the dead. And the thing is, unless you really like digging in old, musty volumes in libraries, you're not going to find easy answers to a question like that. You would have to find some really obscure books out there by experts in Mithraism in order to find a refutation to something like that. That's something I enjoy doing, though. And the answer to that, by the way, is that Mithra never actually died, so of course he never rose from the dead either. But then some of the more obscure facts claimed about him are that he had 12 disciples. It takes a long time and a lot of digging to find out that the mistake made by the critics on that one is that there is a picture of Mithra surrounded by the 12 figures of the zodiac. And that's not disciples. So just a lot of digging, but it's the kind of digging I enjoy doing.
Right, and that was I think there was a documentary series that was very popular that made that allegation that Christ was, something that came out of the old Egyptian or pagan culture. So yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about Zeitgeist?
Zeitgeist, thank you. Yeah, I remember what you came to mind. So you've written a lot. You've written about Mormonism. I'm actually going to do a show on the occult involvement in Mormonism on this Friday, actually, which there's a lot there. Maybe I should check out your book, actually, as part of it. But maybe you can just come back to, your ministry and why you put together this particular book, Defending the Resurrection.
All right. Well, the ministry, the website that you mentioned earlier, began that sometime. Actually began on the internet in 1996 with another gentleman who had a website called the Christian Apologetics Bookshelf. And at some point, I believe he just decided to retire, and he said, "Well, I'm just going to give you all this website material here. You can take it." I knew nothing about HTML language or how to use it. I had to learn that on the fly. I had to do my own redesign from scratch, so to speak. And I ended up buying the domain name tectonics.org because tecton.org was taken by a Greek travel ministry. I ended up with Tectonics, and the website has grown in that time to have thousands of articles written mostly over a 10-year span, starting in about 1998 to 2005. In between that time, I also wrote a number of freelance articles for the Christian Research Journal. That's Hank Hanegraaff's journal from the Christian Research Institute. In particular for defending the resurrection. Well, since the resurrection is at the heart of Christian belief, that's something that inevitably I would have to address. I mean, I would have to investigate and do some reporting and addressing of arguments on that subject. Most of what's in the book is compiled from articles that I wrote and which were updated for the book in most cases, and from the years like 2000 to 2010. And then some of the there were a number of guest articles as well from people who were readers of my website or those who assisted me in various ways or had interest in the subject. And so the Defending the Resurrection was the third in a series of books that I called the Building Block series. The first one was one you alluded to earlier that had to do with the idea that Jesus never existed as a human being. That one was called Shattering the Christ Myth. The second in the series was called Trusting the New Testament and dealt with the issue of the reliability of the transmission of the New Testament in writing, not having to do with the history of it itself, but just with the transmission of the text, so to speak, and the transmission of the history. And then Defending the Resurrection was the third in that series, and it turned out the final one in that particular series.
Gotcha. And maybe we could talk a little bit for people who don't know. The Jesus myth was part of kind of a movement to reevaluate, right? It was kind of an intellectual movement in the academy or in academia to kind of question the validity of the New Testament, right? Is that right?
I would call this an extreme parts of academia, not necessarily people who were experts. The original modern person who was into that theory was G.A. Wells, and he has since that time he's sort of relapsed into a position that, well, maybe Jesus did exist as a human being after all. There are still a number of people around who are promoting that theory. I don't need to go through a catalog of names, but there are two general theories that they promote. One is the idea that the New Testament itself attests to the idea that Jesus never existed, in as much as it is felt that it doesn't give enough details in the letters, such as Paul's, about Jesus. And that they perhaps in mind of Paul, it is supposed Jesus was just some sort of sky high being, not someone who actually walked the earth. And then the other brand of the theory is one we've already alluded to. That's the idea that the story of Jesus was stolen from pagan myths. And so someone took a little Mithra here, a little Dionysus there, and smashed it all together to make Jesus.
Right. And then there's this kind of movement that I've heard from other people, which is that the actual story of the New Testament was created or fabricated by the Flavian dynasty to yeah. Well, that's taken seriously. I've had interviews with people who that's what they really believe. I'm not going to name the author, but they really think that this was created for political reasons, that the New Testament and the validity of the transference of the information, which is the second part of your series, is not, it's fake, that it's actually a narrative that was created.
Yeah, I remember what you're talking about very well, the Piso theory. I believe it was one version of it. I did write an article about that. That was one was enough for me. But there's so many other variations of that from so many different people. It was a conspiracy based on some other particular ideological movement. They're just a dime a dozen, and they all contradict each other.
Oh, interesting. But so what is the validity? We know that one of his disciples wrote, was it John wrote one of the statements saying that he was converted by Peter, right? Isn't that one of the earlier writers? I don't know if you remember that offhand.
No, I don't remember that one. No.
Okay, yeah. But I think that there are people of the first century who knew the apostles, and they have their writing done. That's outside of. I'm trying to get to defending the resurrection. Sorry, I'm getting tangents. But so I think we're just 1 week after Easter. Can you talk about kind of what is in this particular book?
Okay, well, this book is set into 5 different sections, and I'll just briefly describe each section. Section 1 is the exegetical basis for an arguments for the resurrection. That's addressing various interpretations of the New Testament, which are supposed to show that the New Testament itself does not teach that Jesus was bodily resurrected. And so, for example, you have some that say that Paul taught a, quote, spiritual resurrection, that Jesus just rose like some kind of ghost. And you have those who say that the resurrection accounts were borrowed from the Old Testament in some way and just rewritten versions of the Old Testament. Another question we address in there, one of my guest authors, is whether or not Jesus actually predicted his death and resurrection. So it's just dealing with matters of biblical interpretation that affect how we understand the resurrection as presented in the New Testament. Section 2 is called the philosophical basis, and it's rather the shortest section. Just discuss some of the claims about things like whether the resurrection violated natural law, and whether there's sufficient evidence in legal terms to decide that the resurrection occurred. And another thing I discuss in there is the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Third section is called the ideological basis, and that looks at some it's sort of a potpourri of various ideas, such as why would God even bother resurrecting Jesus? What did it mean to the people of the first century? And also whether the resurrection was stolen from Zoroastrianism, whether the New Testament got the idea from the Zoroastrian religion. Section 4 is the longest, and I would say the most unique product that I put together. It's what I call the social basis. And it grew out of a smaller article I wrote called The Impossible Faith, in which I analyze the social world of the New Testament and argue that because of the nature of Christianity and the nature of the first century world, it would have been impossible for anyone to come to believe in Christianity at that time unless there had been sufficient evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And just to use a particular example, the idea of a crucified man. So many people today, when they see Jesus on the cross, they think, oh, that poor man, what did he do to deserve that? Or they think, that he was suffering. Even if you don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God or divine in any way, many people will feel sorry for Jesus when they see him on the cross. But that's not how people of the first century would have thought about someone like that. To them, someone on the cross had died a terrible and shameful death, and most likely because they deserved it. and you needed to have a good explanation for why it was not a shameful event, as opposed to something that you feel sorry about. And I also draw comparisons to other social bases in the first century, such as the idea of resurrection itself being something that was uh, not accepted widely. The Jewish belief at the time was that the resurrection would occur at the end of history, and there was no idea of just one person specially being resurrected out of order, so to speak.
Right. So they weren't expecting the Jews, even after Christ, they're still looking for the resurrection at the end of time, right? And I think
That's
you use in your book the examples from the Old Testament, right?
Yeah. That's a couple of things that I address because, of course, some people will point to examples from the Old Testament that they think are resurrections, but they're not. And the Old Testament itself indicated that there would just be a general resurrection at the end of time. There wasn't any word about one particular person being raised. And the last section in the book, called the historical basis, I addressed just a potpourri of various ideas, such as the idea that Jesus just sort of didn't die on the cross, but just swooned and was revitalized later on by someone. Looking to the idea that the body was stolen, that the disciples went to the wrong tomb, and I get really into the crazy stuff with the idea that Jesus had an evil twin that stole the body and then pretended to be the risen Jesus himself.
Right. I've heard that one. Some famous people believed in that one. There's all
Yeah,
kinds of really crazy stuff out there, and I mean, it really you have to take it away. You can't really believe in the actual narrative of the Gospels, right? To come up with these ideas.
you will have to in some way add to it or subtract from it. It's pretty much a given that you have to do that, which is understandable.
Understandable, right?
Even
And
one that's reasonable, you have to do that.
right, and so the there's an issue of whether I think in the very beginning you kind of was Christ resurrected in spirit or was he resurrected in body? I think that's an important question about the resurrection because people think Christ was just spiritual resurrection, right?
Yeah, that's the general idea. That's the point of this so-called spiritual resurrection argument. It's the idea that when Paul describes what happened in 1 Corinthians 15, he's saying that Jesus was risen only in some sort of spiritual form. Now it's hard to go into great detail on this. There's so many different aspects that are brought to the fore. But when you look at the specific words used by Paul and how he uses them, he makes it quite clear that he's referring to a physical body. And moreover, in the Judaism of the time, there simply was no such idea of a quote spiritual resurrection. The word resurrection specifically meant the body. It's coming back to life. It did not ever mean some sort of spiritual thing going on. And interestingly, this relates to another idea I put later on in the book. Um, if the disciples had seen someone they thought was Jesus after he died, because of what I mentioned earlier about the belief that resurrections would not occur until the end of time, and because of this idea of what a resurrection actually was, if they had seen someone who looked like Jesus walking around after he had died, they would have assumed that it was his guardian angel, because they had a belief that your guardian angel was essentially a duplicate of you. And so that answers one of the verses that's sometimes used in this respect. It's where Luke says, "Well, they thought they saw a spirit." When they saw the risen Jesus the first time, they thought, "Well, that must be his guardian angel." And you can even see that belief alluded to in the book of Acts after Peter is presumed to have been dead, and he comes knocking at the door, and the girl says, "Peter's at the door," and they said, "Oh no, it's his angel." That's that particular Jewish belief being referred to, and that's also what anyone seeing someone who looked like Jesus walking around would have assumed as from the first as well.
Right, and that's how we get the whole story of doubting Thomas, right? That's the whole story about the doubter of the apostles. He
It's
couldn't
related to
believe
that.
it's related
Yes.
to that. He couldn't
Yeah.
believe that this was a person in body, right?
Right. There were a lot of reasons, and it's not because he didn't believe in miracles. I mean, he was a Jewish person. They believed that God had created the world with a snap of his fingers, so to speak. So he had no reservations about believing that God could raise people from the dead. He knew that God would do that, just not at that particular time.
Right. And then you think you point out something interesting about the Jewish tradition that is pre and post Christ, which is the ossuaries and the saving of bones for burial to prep for that ending resurrection, right?
Yes, that's exactly why they preserve well, assuming you were wealthy enough, of course. I mean,
Right.
the poorest people, there was nothing much they could do. They had no way to preserve the bones that way. But the very wealthy people, yes, they had this ability that allowed them to put the body inside a tomb, and they would do seemingly contrarily what they could to like keep the body preserved as long as possible. But they knew eventually it would rot away, and you just leave the bones. And at some point, maybe a year later, you'd go inside the tomb and you'd collect the bones and put them in that ossuary, which is like a box, you might say, and you'd put the bones in there and then put that back in the tomb and wait for the resurrection to happen. Yes.
Right. And so that's kind of important part of the gospel narrative is Christ being taken into, I can't remember the rich guy who put him into that tomb, right? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the Romans wanted to guard it because the leading Pharisees of that time said, these guys, these followers are going to do something and make it sound right.
Yeah, yeah. Joseph and Nicodemus were the two people. It was Joseph's tomb, and Nicodemus was assisting. Now, that's interesting that you would refer to that as well, because that relates to another aspect of why the guard was at the tomb in the first place. Um, yeah, one of the things that they would have been concerned about in particular, and this relates to that whole aspect of crucifixion that I referred to, in order to enforce the shameful sentence of crucifixion and ensure that it stayed shameful, one of the things they would want to stop people from doing was coming to the tomb to venerate Jesus or to mourn him. And so, likely, one of the reasons why the guard was set in the first place was not simply to prevent any theft per se, not necessarily just that, but also to stop anyone from coming to the tomb to mourn and thereby give Jesus some degree of honor that was taken away from him in the view of others by being crucified.
Right. So that's very important to the story. The rolling away of the stone, and there's no body there, right? So that second skin theory, which you mentioned in your book, based upon the gospel narrative, can't be true, right?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why that wouldn't work out, and the involvement of honor here is just so important, and yeah. I also note as well that I don't believe that the disciples were expecting Jesus to be resurrected precisely because of what I mentioned earlier. There was no belief that a single person would rise from the dead. Now, the words used to describe what Jesus predicted would happen are kind of general in sense. They could refer to someone like standing up from a chair. What I think the disciples were expecting to happen, and there's some degree of this found in the way Peter and John react in the Gospel of John, I believe they were expecting Jesus' body to ascend into heaven, sort of like Moses has had, or sort of like some of the other Jewish heroes. And so when they heard him say initially, I will be raised from the dead," their thought was, "Oh, he means his body's going to ascend," and that's why, because they seem like they don't on when they see that he's physically risen from the dead. It's not what they were expecting at all.
Right. So they're not expecting this. And sorry, please continue.
Yeah. And so, in turn, it addresses an argument that, well, they were just psychologically fooled into thinking that Jesus would rise from the dead, and they believed that it happened. If anything, they did not believe that Jesus was going to be resurrected. There was no basis for that. They believed that his body would ascend. So, in fact, they were surprised by what happened.
Right. And so they're in shock. They don't expect that. And you in the Old Testament, he's Christ is saying, he said very mysterious things that people couldn't interpret until the whole gospel story was told, right? Or was told.
Yes, and that was not unusual. I mean, in their social world, the idea was you didn't share things with the people outside your own group. Otherwise, they might subvert what you're doing. So you made it sort of vague in a way, but it became more clear after everything was over with. That wasn't that unusual.
Gotcha. Right. So he said, "I will take this temple and be in there."
Yes,
to read it. Right. So
that's a good example.
Right.
Yes.
So those are kind of some of the stories about the narrative itself and some of the ideas that are out there. when you talk about the philosophical basis of the resurrection, what kind of standards of evidence or context do you look into during that inquiry?
I think most fascinating thing that I've looked at in terms of philosophical basis is about the idea of whether the resurrection violated natural law. And that's a very common refrain that I hear over and over again. It comes from Hume years ago, back in the 1700s, but it's still around today, it's still fresh. There was another author named, oddly enough, Ehrman, not Bart Ehrman, but Ehrman, John Ehrman, who wrote a book about this called Hume's Abject Failure. That's it. And this was one of the main sources I used, along with a couple of others, discussing the idea that the resurrection violated natural law. The assumption is that there's a big difference between natural and supernatural, but that's a dichotomy that was invented much later in time. It was not something that people of the biblical period would have believed in. For them, everything was natural. I mean, they look at it this way: if God picks up a box, that's considered a miracle? Why? I mean, if we pick up a box, we're not violating the law of gravity. So why should God be violating the law of gravity when He picks up a box? It's just not. There's just no differentiation to be made between natural and supernatural, and so the resurrection itself can hardly violate natural law because there's no such thing as violating natural law, so to speak. When you do something like the lifting up of the box, you're not violating the law of gravity. It's just God acting in nature like anyone else.
Gotcha. So, so that's, and you mentioned like there's a maybe you can talk about the legal basis for evaluating the evidence. I mean, what can you find in the Gospels, in the New Testament, that would validate the resurrection?
Well, that chapter was written by one of my guests, W.R. Miller, and I could just sort of summarize it. He drew back on some of the older apologetics that drew on from the legal field, and so he would like compare the witness testimony given in the Gospels, and he would compare it to like the requirements for legal testimony in modern courts. That's how Mr. Miller took care of that.
Gotcha. And I mean, what's the whole? I mean, Paul, you mentioned in the intro to the book, Paul says if Christ wasn't resurrection, then the faith of Christian is in vain, right? So, what's the purpose of the resurrection in God's plan, really?
Well, ultimately, it was a demonstration reversing the shame of the crucifixion. As I was describing earlier, a crucifixion was considered a very shameful death, and it was something enforced by the authorities of the time, as you said earlier, by the Sadducees and also by the Pharisees. It was their way of saying this man is worthy of death. The resurrection was God's way of saying, no, he wasn't, and your whole process of condemning him and shaming him was totally incorrect. So that was the main purpose. And there's a lot more detail I could go into. We don't really have time for it at the moment, but it would have to do with the whole idea of the Christian covenant as what would be called a client-patron agreement in their time. Basically an agreement to live according to the covenant that God presents and for which Jesus is the broker.
Right. So it's an example for everybody, right? Saying that if that's the core, then the resurrection is something in the future for all Christians or all people, right?
Yeah, because you assume as becoming part of the body of Christ in their society, which was focused on the collective experience of all people who were part of the group. If Jesus was resurrected, then eventually you would be as well. Of course, it clarifies we are to imitate Christ, and we would in the same way by being resurrected as well.
Gotcha. And what else? Like when you talk about, I mean, is there anything else in the book? There's a lot more information. We probably covered only half of it. I mean, what else would you like when somebody gets this book? What else can they expect to find?
Well, we'll find too. Let me go a little background here.
Okay.
The original version of the book was simply an article, which was what is in section 4, the social basis, and a mix of other articles from my website. I collated those together, and section 4 became a small food for thought kind of book called The Impossible Faith. which only summarized the social basis for arguing for the resurrection. There were some people who disagreed with that. There was a fellow that I ran into on a forum who hired an atheist to write a rebuttal to that small book, and he paid him $5,000 for it. And I went ahead and included answers to that critic in section 4 of Defending the Resurrection. And so what you'll basically find, though, is a systematic examination of those 5 aspects that I mentioned earlier: exegetical, philosophical, ideological, social, and historical. So this would, in that sense, cover all the traditional sort of arguments you expect on the resurrection, such as, what was the body stolen? But I also approach it from an entirely different perspective. Although I had seen bits and pieces of what I put in the social basis section, I believe this is the first time anyone has ever put those together into a systematic defense of the resurrection as a historical event.
Interesting. And JP, do you have time to take a few questions from the listener?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. One of them is from Oswald. He asks, "Has JP read Scorbina's Jesus book?" I don't know what that is.
I've never even heard of that, so I can go ahead and look that up. And I'm very particular about what books I'll read anymore. I will only read books that are by credentialed scholars. If it's by someone who's not a scholar, I'm probably not going to bother with it. I see this person as a professor of philosophy. That has me questioning whether he would, what kind of book he's writing. I'll go ahead and mark it and have a look at it and see if it's something I might. Is this the Jesus hoax? I don't. That's already got me saying no way. But maybe it has a way to look inside. Maybe I'll have a peek, and I'll tell you what my test will be. If I don't know if I can search in the book right now. The mention of Jesus by Tacitus is one of the most reliable references we have. In fact, the most reliable reference we have, I would say. I will test and see what he says about Tacitus, whether he buys into the crazy arguments that I've seen or whether he takes it seriously. And based on how he treats that will help me decide whether or not I want to bother with it or not.
Gotcha. Have you read Joe Atwill, Caesar's Messiah?
I have, and I have an article on it on my website. It's been ages since I've read those, so I don't remember a whole lot about it, but I do have an article on it. Atwill did respond, I think, some years later, and I responded in turn. But yeah, I don't remember if he commented on the resurrection specifically. I don't think he did. I think his main concern was simply to show that all these alleged parallels existed that supported his idea. The idea that the New Testament was a rewrite of some sort of bowdlerized Roman history.
Right. Yeah. I've heard that. And kind of a little bit off topic, but what are your thoughts about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
There's nothing special about them in terms of like what many of the conspiracy theorists say. I've heard that many of them, I understand many of them are like Old Testament, and that they support the text of the Old Testament as we understand it. That's certainly an excellent thing. There's certainly useful information on one particular sect of Judaism from that time. Gives us a lot of information on that particular sect. So, yeah, definitely a good resource. Very good thing to have found.
Gotcha. And where's the best place to look at all your writing? What's your website again?
Tectonics.org, tektonics.org. Just make sure you put in .org, because if you put in .com, you'll get some guys that build bridges. They don't want to answer your questions about Jesus.
Gotcha. No, we don't want that. And is that the best place for people if they want to reach out to you, ask you any questions or anything like that?
Yeah. I've got a couple of places there where you can click for an email address, and that'll come to me.
And do you have any books that are coming out? I mean, you've written so many books. Are you working on anything that'll be published in the near future? I
am working on I'm almost done with an update to one of our books I wrote with Nick Peters called Defining Inerrancy. Well, that's worth a talk about the background of that one. Back in 2014, I was involved in a dispute between Christian scholar Mike Licona, who has written an excellent book on the resurrection, and the Christian apologist Norman Geisler, and it has to do with the interpretation of the Bible and how to understand the inerrancy of the Bible. Geisler's idea was more of what I would call a fundamentalist view, whereas Lacona held to a view more like mine, which is a contextualized view, understanding in terms of the history and the background. And I got involved in that debate. And so Nick and I wrote Defining Inerrancy to help frame that debate. And since Norman Geisler passed away in 2019, we decided it was a good time to sort of update that book, and we're hoping to have that out sometime in the next month.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to taking a look at that. Is that the best place to buy books? Can they buy signed copies of your books from your website?
Well, since most of my books are ebooks now, can't really sign them. But yeah, I'll be glad to print out a page and sign it and mail it to them.
Gotcha. But so then the best place is Amazon, or do you have other websites where you sell your ebooks, or is it Amazon the best?
No, just Amazon is the best one. Yeah.
Gotcha. And you have links on your website to those Amazon books, because I know that you have kind of a different name, and so not all your books show up in one spot, right? Except on your website.
Yeah, that's the best place to find them. I will feature one in particular on the front page, and I'll feature some on the side of some of the articles. Yeah, so
great. And is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we end the interview?
The only other book I'd like to note that I wrote, which I'm particularly glad about, was called Hitler's Christianity. That was one where I did some, I think, investigation of a type that's not been done before, because so many people assume that I looked into Hitler's original belief system, and there was actually sort of a cult at the time in Germany that went by positive Christianity. And it was pretty clear that that's the kind of Christianity Hitler believed in. But so many people don't recognize that because they don't understand some of the illusions that Hitler made when he was speaking, and some of his followers made when they were writing and speaking. It was really a fascinating topic to look into. I enjoyed that one very much.
Was it your view that he was a Christian, or was he just using some of the ideology for his ideas?
Closer to the second. And one of the things that I also addressed was this idea that Hitler was an occultist, which is also not true. He wasn't the least interested in that.
Interesting. Another question for Mr. Regents, dude. Was Jesus in hell before he resurrected? So for those 3 days, what's your view of that?
No, I don't believe he was in hell. Now, here, boy, that's going to get into another thing of what is hell. I don't. You mentioned the book "What in Hell Is Going On." I discussed the idea of hell in terms of their honor-shame view. I don't view hell as a place. I view it as more like a state or a relationship to God. So someone who is, quote, in hell is not in a particular place. They just don't have access to God. So I can't really say that Jesus was, quote, in hell, because I don't think it was a particular place. But I do believe that there was some, he did go to a particular place to preach to the spirits, so to speak, or it's actually the fallen spirits. But no, not hell particularly. You wouldn't call it hell.
Interesting. Well, I'd love to have you back on to talk about Hitler's Christianity. That sounds I read Hitler's psychological profile, so people can see the whole 7-part under my podcast. So his psychological profile is very interesting. His background,
to say the least.
Yeah. Wow. So, but again, delighted to have you. Thanks for sharing all that information. Again, the author's name is J.P. Holding, Holding. Title of the book is Defending the Resurrection. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And the website, which I will put in the show notes, is www.tectonics.org. So JP Holding, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you for having me, William.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
God bless.